My name is Nicola Balvin. I am part of the research team that had worked on the state of the world's children, which is the topic that we are focusing on this evening. And I will be moderating tonight's event. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Neil Graboy, Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy, to open the event with his welcoming remarks.
Urban areas offer great potential to improve, or not, unfortunately, the lives of children. Having grown up in New York City in a tough neighborhood in Brooklyn, I needed some UNICEF help, but it wasn't there 100 years ago. However, poverty and inequity are a painful reality all over the urbanized world, representing a challenge for development and for human rights. This is one of the key issues on which the Milano International Affairs Program concentrates its teaching and research efforts. Today's program represents the best of what the Milano School has to offer: a world-class gathering of scholars, students, and practitioners discussing and debating today's most pressing global issues.
Over half of the world's 7 billion people now live in urban areas. More than 1 billion children live in cities and towns, and we have one of them with us here tonight, which is a pleasure to have. Many of them enjoy the advantages of urban life, including access to education, medicine, medical facilities, recreational services. However, hundreds of millions of children live in informal settlements and slums under some of the most challenging conditions on earth. They endure hunger, they endure ill health, and the denial of such crucial services as education, clean water, and sanitation. This should inspire shame and action on the part of the political, commercial, and cultural elites who live in the very same cities. And yet, for all their deprivations, the residents of low-income neighborhoods, informal settlements, and slums contribute to the very economies and societies that marginalize them. These families provide the relatively inexpensive labor that powers so many enterprises, and they consume many of the goods and services produced by these enterprises. I know from my own experience, growing up in urban Egypt, what it can mean to live in a low-income neighborhood. As young people, we were always torn between our desire to make things better on the one hand, and on the other hand, our lack of resources and inability to influence or even be informed about municipal and government affairs. But what really bothered us, what really bothered me growing up in that neighborhood was the unpredictability of it all. Being at the receiving end of decisions made by the powerful without warning and without explanation. People who live in urban poverty can and should be involved in making decisions about issues affecting their life. Indeed, this is the right. This means better information, better participation, and better representation. As the State of the World Children report that we gathered here tonight to discuss points out, positive change follows when the excluded are no longer shunned, but instead granted the right to take part in local decision-making.
When we were putting this report together, The State of the World's Children, one of the themes that came out most strongly were the disparities that are found in urban areas between children from poorer households and those from wealthy households. And that was a very strong theme throughout. And although we mainly looked at countries in the developing world and middle-income countries, such disparities exist everywhere, including here in New York City. So what better way to start tonight's panel than to have young people from New York City itself come and tell us about some of the challenges and opportunities they face in their daily lives.
We are teenagers of color It may seem like an obvious thing to say, but the combination affects us everywhere we go in the city. It's a hard thing to talk about sometimes, but the stereotypes that all different groups had towards us, from teachers to police to strangers on the subway, have to be discussed if we're ever going to move past them. Take a time to think about your first impression of me when I walked up on stage. Chances are your impression was affected by my age or the color of my skin. That's not okay. But if we don't acknowledge that it happens all the time, we can't get past it. I want you to see me for me, not for the categories I fall into. But I have to work twice as hard to overcome negative impressions and fears. A few weeks ago, for example, I was walking home from the store. It was raining, so I had my hood up, and I was walking fast. There were other people walking down the street, too. But when the Chinese food delivery man saw me coming, he literally stopped what he was doing and ran away, sprinting. Because a young black man was walking quickly towards him, the worst part is, it didn't surprise me very much. I was used to being treated that way. Unfortunately, it's not just strangers like that who think the worst of us. People in position of authority, like adults, teachers, and the police, fall for the same stereotype. None of us would call the police an emergency given the choice. Because we all have experienced police assuming we're in gangs or stopping and searching us for no good reason. Just last week, we were in Washington, D.C. preparing a speech, and a policeman showed up in our car on the train, just to watch in case the group of 12 teenagers of color, went crazy, started a brawl, set the whole thing on fire. It's hard to show them they're wrong about us when they're too busy keeping us under control to listen. When you live in a city like New York, where first impression is all you ever make most of the time, it can take a toll. How many times do you expect us to respond to that kind of treatment without getting angry? As someone in our group said, you think I'm a violent person, but you're wrong. Hitting someone is a way of expressing my feelings because no one wants to listen to me when I speak. How is she supposed to change that if people just keep assuming that that's true?
Is urban poverty spatially concentrated? That is, when we think of the poor in urban areas, are we thinking in the colloquial sense of those who live in slums, in communities of concentrated disadvantage? Okay? Is that where we find the poor? Okay. Well, to answer the question, we would have to be clearer than we have been on what we mean when we say slums and how we would know one when we saw one. Where are those places? Then we would have to answer two very basic questions to which we do not yet have even an approximate answer, despite what you might have thought. What proportion of the urban poor live in slums? Okay. And what proportion of all slum residents are poor? Okay. Two sides of a similar question. And then we have to ask further, if slums are indeed communities of a concentrated disadvantage, how long do children and others remain there subject to those disadvantages? In poor, 1 person in 5 lives in a slum. Now, I think that's doubtless quite an understatement, so let's make it 2 in 5. Okay? That still would leave the proportion of slum dwellers at less than half. Right? And somehow, in our thinking, in our policies, in even our conceptions of urban poverty, we have not got fixed in our mind's eye the image of the urban poor who live outside slums. And of course, there are certain groups in which I think many of you in this audience will be especially familiar, whom we know to be disadvantaged, socially isolated. I'm thinking of girls, adolescent girls who work and in domestic labor. Right? They work in homes that are not necessarily to be found in the slums, in somewhat better off environments. Right? And so if we go only to the slums looking for these girls, we won't find enough of them.
Usually when we work with poverty, all the time people is saying rural poverty is the worst situation. I agree, it's a very bad situation. But what happened is we use average in the urban areas. We don't look beyond the average. So in that case, I think that is important, and that's why poverty and disaggregation in urban areas is very, very important. I think that your point on the slum is very important because it's not only the slum. We need to look at much broader sense of that. So basic in what? Fairness. Fairness and social justice. We want another world. We want another world for everyone, for the adults, for the young people, for everyone. So social justice is the main point. I think that we need to think on two kinds of inequalities. One is vertical inequalities. That is the one that usually people think about. Income, level of education, that kind of things that are very important. But there is another that is called horizontal inequalities. That is basically discrimination. Groups that can have similar income, but they are discriminated. Why? Because of religion, because of being girls, because of their ethnic questions, yeah? Because of where they live, yeah? So vertical, horizontal inequalities are very powerful mobilizers for people.
The child-friendly cities and communities model is really trying to provide a vision for what that can look like. And this vision is rooted in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I have to say this every time I give this presentation in the United States because we all know that, well, maybe we don't, that the United States and Somalia are the only two countries in the world that have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so it's really great to have this conversation occur here in the United States. This convention outlines minimum standards for children's well-being, protection, and development. And so what the Child-Friendly City movement is about is taking those rights that have been framed at the national level and trying to bring it down to the local level so that children's rights are realized. So a child-friendly city is a city that's committed to a process for the realization of children's rights. And UNICEF has done some great work around what this might look like. So what's a top-down approach? What can local authorities, commissioners, city agencies, mayors do to help make their city child-friendly? There's the 9 building blocks. And at the core of it is children's participation, their voice in concerns and matters for young people. It also could entail having a child-friendly legal framework, a system of cross-sectoral planning for children. So the Department of Transportation and the MTA is talking and communicating with the Department of Education and the Department of Youth and Community Development, and everyone is kind of coming to a consensus about what needs to happen with children's participation in these domains. So people have talked about data. We need to have data that express young people's opinions in a way that local authorities can also feel comfortable acting on it. We hear these great stories, but I think local authorities would also like to have some data, some real hardcore information about what percentage of the population feels the same way that you do, you know? And so UNICEF is also trying a bottom-up approach by helping to develop toolkits that enable young people to lead assessments, child rights assessments of their communities and their schools themselves.
The unifying principles that drive DYCD are very similar to what we've heard here today, which are equity, accountability, and maximizing community engagement. And so by emphasizing these principles, we're able to make sure that our resources are really going where they're needed most, and also that we are supporting high-quality programming. I was particularly struck by the overlap between some of the approaches we have taken here in New York City and the themes and recommendations in the State of the World's Children 2012 report. First and foremost was the need to really understand the scale and nature of poverty affecting children. And as you probably know, in 2006, the mayor established, and uniquely established, the commission to look at poverty in New York City called the Center for Economic Opportunity, to really make sure that we understood the extent of poverty and then to take those steps that would be necessary to combat poverty. And that report and that commission really focused on 3 critical groups, including young children, young people ages 16 to 24, and working adults. And many pilots came out of that commission report in 2006. Many are not here today, but I'm proud to say that the 3 that we were funded for are still here, and one of them is Teen Action. So I really credit the mayor for allowing us to do that innovative work, which I think so nicely captures youth voice, and more importantly, not only youth voice, but youth action. We also are very focused on removing the barriers to inclusion, and whether that means that we have free services, which all the services that come out of my agency are free, or whether that means that we use lotteries so that very transparent processes, so everybody is really starting in the same place, or whether that means that we have, as part of our solicitations, special sections that really focus on young people who may not have been served well by government in the past. Young people with disabilities, those aging out of foster care, court-involved youth, LGBTQ youth, etc.
So, seeing that it's about community engagement, I think it's important for those of us who are less youthful to also step back and engage. There is a couple of, what is the solution? Where do we go? There were some slides, and there's in the report, it highlights where are some best examples, some best cases that we can take forward in other countries. There's a phenomenal one in Brazil called the Municipal Seal Program that many of us are familiar with and UNICEF has supported. I would encourage us to read that and think a little bit more about how that can be scaled up in other countries. It has managed to tweak the accountability and dialogue around these issues and has made a very tangible difference. UNICEF, my last message is, I think we're looking at needing a critical mass or a tipping point. And maybe today, as Mark had said, maybe today is the beginning of a new era of working in urban areas, of development organizations like UNICEF, but also the good work that takes place in wealthier countries. And we obviously would just be one small part of working with all of you and many others outside this room to sort of generate this critical mass to address the imbalances and inequities that are very apparent in the world today around poor kids living in urban areas. So we fully endorse everything that's been said and look forward to engaging with all of you further. Thank you.